The views and opinions expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of Natural Bridges Media or KSQD's staff, volunteers, or underwriters.
Hello and welcome to Talk of the Bay.
I'm your host, Len B.A., and with me today is Stephen Gonzalez Monserrate. Stephen Gonzalez Monserrate is a postdoctoral researcher at the Fixing Futures Research Training Group at Goethe University. He received his PhD in the History, Anthropology, Science, Technology, and Society program at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. His current book project, Cloud Ecologies, is an environmental ethnography of data centers in New England, Arizona, Puerto Rico, and Singapore. Committed to public engagement and accessible scholarship, his writing and research appears in venues including Wired, Aeon, Popular Science, Anthropology News, ABC News, BBC News, NPR, and more. Stephen holds an MA in Anthropology from Brandeis University and a BA in Feminist Anthropology from Keene State College. He is also a filmmaker and a speculative fiction writer under the byline E.J. Conde. Stephen Gonzalez Monserrate, welcome to Talk of the Bay.
Thank you so much for having me, Len.
Well, here, ironically, perhaps, here we are communicating over the internet. And it seems to be the case that for certainly the vast majority of people in the industrialized nations and growing numbers of people all over the world are using essentially cloud, what we call the cloud, remote data centers to store and transfer data between us and store it for us and so forth. It's a monstrosity of data. I've heard a few numbers, and perhaps you know some of them. I don't know the statistics, but I know, just for example, that something like 1 million videos are uploaded to YouTube every day. So when you think about that as a cumulative number, it's beyond imagination. So I wanted to start by asking you a little bit about how you found yourself looking into data centers.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it does seem like a strange place for an anthropologist to spend his time. And so for me, my journey kind of began as an undergraduate. I was really interested in anthropology and just I was fascinated by the sheer diversity of the human experience and all of our creative capacities and the things that we share, but also the incredible differences that we have in different communities and everything from language to culture and so forth. But for me, for some reason, I wanted to do a kind of anthropology of transportation or infrastructure. And so my first project was studying a local bus system in the small town of Keene, New Hampshire. And I was really just so amazed by how people created these whole worlds through infrastructure, this system of buses that linked people together and allowed people to move from place to place. And it wasn't until much later, after I had graduated, that I ended up working in marketing for a sensor technology company. And this company sold these air sensors that could measure air in really critical locations, like a clean room or a laboratory, for instance. But then one of our clients was this thing called a data center, which at the time, it was 2012 or 2013, excuse me. I wasn't really sure what a data center was. I knew it involved computers and storage of information. And in the course of doing this job, I actually set foot inside of a data center. And I was just so shocked and intrigued immediately by what these giant warehouses. You can imagine just walking into like a giant warehouse with all of these racks of servers that look almost like library shelves stacked on opposing sides. And some of them are in these glass gables, almost like a greenhouse, right? And so, and what I saw were all of these men, and it's a very kind of masculine workspace. All these men running around, and not that many, but a handful of men kind of running around and diagnosing servers, moving things around, checking sensors, and I was immediately fascinated and intrigued. And so I left that job so that I could pursue graduate study on this topic of data centers. And since 2015, I've been studying them as an anthropologist.
Wow, that's a wonderful story, and so interesting that you were able to follow that impulse. My career has been in saving energy in commercial and industrial buildings and doing the engineering for that. And especially around the same era that you walked into a data center, I did a bunch of work in data centers, kind of 2007 through 2013 era. And, similar, it's sort of a surreal impression. You walk into this vast chamber of computers just humming, and all the cooling equipment that goes into keeping the temperatures right and the humidity right, and the changing technology at the time, because now we have much more efficient ways of setting up data centers. But I got to be a little bit on the leading edge of being able to separate things between hot and cold aisles and all that kind of stuff. So it's such a strange phenomenon, and I don't know, without having the chance to be in one, I don't know how well to convey that, but it is interesting because all it is a vast amount of computer circuitry all operating at once, and it's generating heat, so it has to have that heat removed, and it needs it to be relatively clean and dry, and all the other requirements that go with that. Although I do have to mention an anecdote that Intel in an Oregon facility set a bunch of servers outside of a building under a tin roof. Like outside, the roof kept the rain off, but otherwise it was outside. And it operated like that for like 2.5 years before they got the space to move them in. So, maybe we're on overkill, but we'll see. So what is the scale now today of data centers? How many are they? How big are they? What are we talking about?
So things have really changed from when I started this project, or when I first discovered what a data center was back in 2013, 2014. The field has significantly changed. And as you pointed out earlier, the technologies and the kind of strategies and even the architecture of data centers, like how they are built and designed, is very different than when it first kind of began in the early 2000s into the 2010s. So the predominant kind of setup was this thing called raised floor, which was a way to kind of build a kind of cooling plenum or reservoir of pressurized air underneath where the servers are and the racks are arrayed, and then using pressure and air pressure to kind of push this cool air up into the servers that needed it. And eventually it even became more sophisticated, and the cold and the hot were partitioned, and things just kept getting more and more sophisticated. And so into the 2010s, you have more water-based technologies coming onto the scene. And this was one way that Google, Microsoft, and many other companies were able to cut their carbon emissions somewhat. They were able to kind of flatten the curve of exponential electricity consumption with carbon emissions a little bit by making their facilities a little bit more energy efficient. And so water was one way, but there are other strategies as well, like the ways that they were able to actually use software and firmware to kind of use intelligence, what we call precursor to the kind of AI we talk about now, to efficiently distribute the workload on each server. So if you can think of the servers as workers, pooling that work efficiently so that less energy is used. So there's all of these ways that the scene has changed. But one thing that I have noticed and I think is really important to note is that the cutting edge, the kind of the people who are the pioneers or the leaders of this industry, you think of Google, you think of Meta, you think of these giant futuristic data centers with like the workers are on scooters and they're having a great time and everything is so efficient. That is not actually the status quo of data centers. Hyperscale data centers of that magnitude with that many resources are actually not the majority of what you find out there. There are actually a significant number of data centers that resemble the ones that I first walked into in 2013. And I think this is the part of the story that the media kind of forgets about. And also, if you don't know the scene, you don't know the space, you don't really realize that there are actually still a lot of data centers that are very resource poor. But what we have found is that the demand for data centers has not slowed. The demand for energy that data centers use has not flattened. Yes, it's become a little bit more energy efficient. But if we think about all the data centers, all of our network devices, everything that the internet touches, that many of us who are not technical people call the cloud, this is the equivalent amount of energy that the airline industry uses every year, right? This is a shocking kind of figure for some people. So the electricity that it's using is significant. The carbon footprint of that is somewhat significant. But there are other areas that we should be concerned about as well, like water, as I said earlier. So it's really grown and exploded, and now there are many different data centers throughout the world. They were primarily located in the U.S. and Europe, but now there's more in Asia. There's some new data centers being developed in Latin America and Africa. It's grown significantly.
Yeah, and I understand that the scale of energy use now is, comparable to the whole energy use of the United Kingdom, which is a lot. I mean, that's like adding a whole industrialized country to the world's energy demand, and that's really profound. And another oddity of all this, of course, is they're typically will have their own, if they're not in an area where there is a really well-established electrical infrastructure, a lot of data centers have their own electrical generating plants. And I wonder if you could talk about, how that happens, where it happens, and kind of how that's affecting the people around where those data centers are located.
Yeah, so this is a really important point. So because data centers, not only are they just using energy, they also are built for a level of redundancy or reliability that is very extreme. So if you can think about the inside of a data center as kind of a series of nested fail-safes, chains of redundancy, what we call hyper redundancy, so that if the local grid fails, the data center does not fail. Because if let's say on average, some data centers, if even for just 1 minute of downtime or service outage or interruption, that can be tens of thousands of dollars lost per minute. So this is avoided at all costs. This is achieved by way of diesel generators, for instance, is one of these redundancies is by creating fleets of diesel generators that are always kind of in a state of ready or hot standby, ready to activate if there's any kind of interruption to the power supply. And so the other level of redundancy is the grid itself, right? So if the local grid is too taxed or is insufficiently performing for the needs of the data center, they will build their own grid, or they will build their own node into the grid. Another thing that data centers do is they build renewable energy infrastructure. Tech companies build renewable energy infrastructure. And this is somewhat of a good thing, but there are still costs to this, right? So they will build wind farms or solar farms to kind of offset the carbon emissions, but also it's not just the carbon emissions, it's also we need to produce more energy to offset the energy that we're using so that the local towns don't have blackouts and brownouts like they do in Ireland, for instance, because of the significant consumption of electricity. Over now close to 20% of the electricity is devoted to data centers, and that's pretty significant.
Wow.
So there are a lot of concerns about electricity use, not only because of carbon emissions, but you have to think about data centers as very local in terms of their effects on communities. And as I said, Ireland is a small place, and so when you use a lot of energy, it's very felt, and the grid is not strong enough to support the quantity of data centers. And to your point about power construction, there's a kind of famous case of renewable energy carbon offsets gone wrong, where a kind of literal carbon offset occurred in Ireland as a result of Amazon Web Services contracting in this energy to produce this wind farm in the peatlands of Ireland in the kind of north area. And this created a chain reaction that actually, in the process of constructing the wind farm, they destabilized a vast tract of peat, and there was a massive bog slide, like a peat slide. And so there are actually videos of this of somebody watching a forest appear to just move on its own, and all of that peat went into the river system, and that's a really kind of fragile ecosystem where the salmon come in every year. And so there are real consequences of the scale of this computational thing that we call cloud, and they're very local. They're not these abstract numbers and percentages that you hear in the media.
Right. And I know, even for example, Apple has a huge solar farm in southern San Benito County, which for where we're broadcasting from is quite nearby. And when you drive by it, it's many hundreds of acres covered by solar collectors. And, for all that, the solar, of course, the impact on the land is one thing, but there's the impact of getting all the materials to build all of that.
Yeah. Right.
Which brings me to another angle on the data centers. Like the data centers are, well, they're in buildings, but they're composed of computers, and computers are composed of a lot of different minerals, some of which are in somewhat short supply at present. And I wonder if you could talk about the impact in terms of resource consumption.
Yeah, this is such an important point. I'm so glad that you brought it up, Len. So it's also important to think about the cloud as material, as literally elements and minerals and metals. With the way that the tech industry pushes this constant upgrade mentality, right? So the moment that you buy a phone, you hear about the next one. And you're told to there's so much pressure for you to upgrade your phone, when in fact it's not because we can't design a phone that could last 5 to 10 years. It's because they choose not to design it that way so that they can reap more profits. And there is a huge consequence to this because, and the same would go for the servers that make up data centers, but it's a little bit different because it's not so much about fad and fashion as it is about the fact that data centers need, again, high reliability. And if you're using a server that is more than 3 years old and that's out of warranty, it is not allowed. And so that server is just disposed of. And because of the confidentiality requirements for some of these data centers, they are not really recycled, or only very select components are recycled. But what this all results in this whole system, from the phone to the server to the computers, is an e-waste issue wherein only 20%, the UN e-waste monitor have reported that only 20% of the electronic waste that we generate every year is actually recycled. And of that percentage that's recycled, the recycling itself is very fraught. There isn't a lot of accountability. There isn't a lot of good ways to track where things end up. This results in this massive illicit trade of electronic components. And they end up in these e-waste graveyards and Superfund sites. People actually have created an entire economy of salvage around pilfering components from disk drives and phones. And the process of doing that, of actually smelting out the copper that's worth something, or smelting out the cobalt, or any of these minerals or metals, it can be very toxic for the person who's doing it. Like, it can actually toxify their bodies, but it can also be polluting to the local watershed, the soil, and so forth. And so that's really terrible. But as you also brought up, Len, it starts even before that. So where do these minerals and metals come from? One place that they come from is the Congo and parts of Latin America. And right now we know that there is a civil conflict in the Congo happening. The technology, what we call conflict minerals, involved lithium and all these other minerals that we're using for phones and so forth, is at the heart of that conflict. And the way that these minerals and metals are often procured are under horrific conditions, where children are often working in these artisanal mines that are so small that adults just can't go in there because their bodies are too large. And so you can imagine what are the labor conditions involved and what are the ethics of that. And this is what we have created over the last 25 years, is this monstrous kind of economy and this circulation of all these metals and minerals. And it's just fundamentally not sustainable.
Yeah, really isn't. For listeners who may have just joined us, my guest is Stephen Gonzalez Monserrate. He's a postdoctoral researcher at the Fixing Futures Research Training Group at Goethe University. He has a PhD from MIT in History, Anthropology, Science, Technology, and Society, which is a wonderful integration of subjects. And we're talking about the cloud. Well, and maybe in other terms, data centers, and what it means to have this enormous dependency now in our communications and technology on these data centers that consume so much energy and resources worldwide. So, Stephen, where are we finding most? You mentioned that there are data centers now being, built in parts of the world that we wouldn't necessarily expect them. But so at this point in time, where are most of them, and how is that affecting the places where they're located?
Yeah, that's a great question. So actually, most of the world's data centers are concentrated in Northern Virginia. And actually 2/3 of the world's internet traffic, about 2/3, passes through Northern Virginia every single day.
Wow.
And this is a problem for the people in this area, because this concentration of data centers is creating noise as a result of the operation of the servers, but also the diesel generators that are run to kind of provide backup power. And that also affects things like air quality, as all these fleets of diesel generators are operating. And so there's the confluence of noise, of air pollution, and also the electricity drain from that many data centers in this area, which is comprised of kind of small towns for the most part. And so people in these towns are protesting and organizing against the data centers there because of the way that they're impacting the community. But data centers are located all over the world. They're located in places like the Arctic, like Iceland, where I spent time as a researcher. And there they can harness the really kind of great, cool ambient year-round temperatures to cool their data centers efficiently, and they can use the power grid, which is mostly renewable, 97 or 96% renewable from hydroelectric and geothermal power, to create a whole data center hub. But then you have data centers also in places like Arizona, which is a desert. And as anyone who's lived in the desert southwest of the U.S. can attest, the temperatures there can get upwards of 120 degrees Fahrenheit in the summer. So why would you cluster computers there? But But there's also this question of water, which is used to cool them. And why would you draw so much water from a desert to cool computers? This is a reality, that there is a vast cluster of data centers in the desert Southwest. And so, yeah, there is, and this is sort of the subject of my dissertation in my book, is just there is this vast kind of ecology of computation that's happening in different parts of the world, and whether you're in the tropics or the desert or the Arctic or these more temperate zones, this affects how you run a data center and what the costs are, both locally and globally.
Right. And at this point, I know there are data centers run by, well, you mentioned Northern Virginia. I imagine at least one or two of those are probably run by the government. But
yes,
but the vast majority of data centers worldwide seem to be private developments. Is that true?
that is correct. Yeah. So public data centers are they're all over the world, right? And there's a reason for that. The government wants its data close to its people. And when there are geopolitical disruptions or issues, they want to be able to have their government data within their own country's borders, right? Because that can be a problem if there is some kind of disruption of relations with another country later. So, so yeah, there's a practical reason for that, and sometimes it's also legally required for governments to do that based on whatever laws they have. But for the most part, private industry has been the developer of data centers and our computational resources and storage system worldwide.
So with all that going on, obviously it's being driven by products that are sold and bought, that we're using, and we're creating this ever increasing demand for data storage and data interchange. It seems like we're kind of creating a predicament, that ultimately is going to come up against some limits that we all perceive. Obviously, right now, some people who are near data centers are perceiving those limits today. But for a lot of us, it's kind of remote. We're still comfortably using our cell phones and using the internet, and I'm still so old school that I can't imagine. Oops, excuse me. Okay, okay. I'm so old school that I still want to have my data storage on my computer instead of putting it on the cloud. But most of the computers for sale today depend on the cloud for storage. And so that demand just keeps going up and up and up. So what would be an appropriate way to get beyond all of this, or to at least mitigate some of the effects?
This is a great question, and it's going to be a question I think as a society, we're going to continue to ask ourselves. And for me, it comes down to, some people that I talk to say after they talk to me, they feel like they must confess their digital sins, like the amount of videos that they upload every day, or how many emails they send. And there are people who create, certain figures that say, oh yes, each email is 0.01 kilograms of carbon. And, these figures are very useful to kind of think with. But they aren't really useful in the sense of, as I said earlier, the cloud is very local in its effects. And in that way, the solution must also be, I think, a little bit more local than what we'd like to believe. Because, how much energy a data center uses and what percentage of that energy is actually renewable is very much a local question. So there is no universal figure of X amount of terawatts equals X amount of kilograms of carbon. That's just not true. It can never be true, because it depends on where the energy comes from. How much of that electricity is, So anyway, for me, the solution has to be local. And we've already kind of started to see that with data center activism. We need, in my opinion, comprehensive regulation of these industries. we're seeing some of that energy bubble up now around artificial intelligence and the threat that it poses existentially to human civilization, but also to jobs and so forth and privacy. But that energy was not there prior to AI, kind of entering this conversation, that energy to regulate tech at this level. But there is a reason why they have been able to do everything that they have. It's because they don't have regulation. And that regulation can occur at the local level, as was the case with some of the people that I worked with and studied. One example is Dobson Noise Coalition in Chandler, Arizona, where the people there were able to successfully organize in their community to get the city to pass a noise ordinance because the data centers were so noisy and they were really disruptive to the lives of the people around them. They were causing all kinds of health issues. And after about 4 years or I would say actually 5 years of activism, of town meetings, community meetings, protests, letters to the editor, everything you could imagine, they were actually successful in getting the city to do something about it. Now, the city could only do very little because so the city could only do so much, right? Because these data centers were approved months before, years before, and they had already been built. And so you can't really unbuild them once they're there. It's hard to get rid of them because the contracts that they sign are also for very long periods of time. But
Right.
the point of that story is that the local is a pathway to regulation, is a pathway to change, especially when the problems that data centers cause are locally felt.
Well, we're going to take a short break and we'll be right back with more with Stephen Gonzalez Monserrate and the magnitude and dilemma of the cloud. Don't touch that dial. Welcome back to Talk of the Bay. My guest is Stephen Gonzalez Monserrate. We have been talking about the cloud and data centers. Stephen is a postdoctoral researcher at the Fixing Futures Research Training Group at Goethe University in Frankfurt, Germany. And he has a PhD from MIT and is working on a book project, Cloud Ecologies. So, Stephen, you have been looking at data centers from really an anthropological perspective. And I wondered if you could talk about, when we talk about anthropology, we're talking about people and culture and how societies are formed and change over time. And so I wondered if you could give us, kind of take us along on your journey through what you are discovering in this process.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, as being an anthropologist in a data center has been very interesting, to say the least. And for some people, it might be really difficult to imagine what it's like to work in a data center. And the research method of anthropology is something called ethnography, where, in short, it's just a way of getting information or doing research that's based on like cultivating relationships with people and observing them, but also participating in their lives and doing what they do to learn about it yourself. And so I was privileged to have this experience of kind of working in the data center in the capacity of something like an intern who would help lift things and move things around. And I would ask a lot of questions and try not to be too annoying, and getting in the way was something I did probably every day to some degree. And I tried to atone for it by doing the menial tasks that nobody wanted to do. But in the course of doing this, you have conversations with people and you learn about what the world means to them and looks like for them. And that was really interesting because I thought of data centers as like these sterile technological places where there's computers and there's guys running around and they're just fixing computers. But over the course of being there, I realized things are a lot livelier than I would have expected. And so these these servers, and I think this also is an artifact of just spending all this time alone in a facility or with very few people running around this kind of like scary looking futuristic facility with blinking lights and roaring servers. I discovered that actually some of the computers had names, nicknames, that some of them were given attributes that were kind of almost like people. So when this one server was overheating, for instance, they called it temperamental or fussy. They used words that were sometimes gendered, so they would like gender the server. This is a feminine server, and we need to fix her. We need to change this, or and so there were all of these things that came up, which I wasn't expecting to find, and these kinds of the other thing that really surprised me is, again, this is a technical workplace. You think engineering principles, you think maths, you think all this kind of stuff. And yes, there was a lot of that. There were a lot of sensors, there were a lot of readings and gadgets and so forth. But there was also this really fascinating insistence on using the human senses. So some of these technicians could smell a burning cable before any fire alarm or any kind of detection device went off. And they would do this through what you call a walkthrough, where you walk through all of the halls of the server to the data center to make sure that there are no things that the sensor readouts aren't capturing. So they could smell a burning server. They could hear a fan that was in a state of overheating or overworking before any alarm tripped. These were things that they just were able to acquire after spending all of these hours in this place. And so that really fascinated me so much as an anthropologist.
Yeah, no kidding. And then, of course, these people have lives outside of the workplace.
Mm-hmm.
Is that something that you have touched on?
Yes, to some degree. So I think given what a lot of people probably don't realize too is that if your title is data center manager, you have a significant responsibility, and that responsibility can be haunting in some ways. So I would talk to data center managers sometimes outside of work. We would go to a bar or go somewhere and just talk freely about our lives and about what it was like, and they would confess to me that it was incredibly stressful. That they would at night that they would dream of the data center, that they actually brought their data center home with them, in the sense of they had these remote sensing capabilities on their phones to find out what was happening. And so the job of managing the data center did not end when they clocked out of their shift. There was this sense of on call, this sense of hypervigilance, and many of them confessed that was adversely impacting their health, that they had to see a counselor for this, that they needed to take hypertension medication. And some of these men, and again, it's a very masculine space, so most of the workers were men, reported things like hypertension, high blood pressure, just high stress from this fear that something might go wrong in the data center. Because what was the standard in the industry up until recently was that if the data center manager, were found to be responsible for one of these, for a failure that was avoidable and that cost the company quite a lot of money, you would be fired for even just one incident of downtime that could be proven to be your fault, kind of directly your fault. So there is also that sense of the high risk, high stress environment, and for that reason, a lot of the people who work in here are actually ex-military. And so military veterans were very sought after and recruited, because they would think of the data center as like a ship or a submarine that needed to be managed with all its systems and so forth.
Right. Yeah. And I know from my own experience working in data centers that managers would be extremely sensitive about any change.
Mm-hmm.
I remember in one case, this is a data center where different sections were divided off, so they were actually independent of each other, even though the whole building, except for one small little wing, was offices. The rest was data center. There were actually like sort of data center blocks, and there'd be one room with its own cooling system, and its own, whatever, thousands of servers, and then another room. So in one room, we were actually showing, like, let's go look at the label on your servers. And it says, entering air should be below the equivalent of, it was in centigrade, but the equivalent of about 85 Fahrenheit. And it said entering air. And they're trying to keep the room temperature at 72, which is the whole room, including the exiting air, all of it mixed. So we're saying, look, your servers say right here that you could go up in temperature, which would save an enormous amount of energy in the operation.
Yeah.
He said, oh yeah,
Right.
but not this one. And he says, come here. And he takes me over to basically, I'll say, one out of probably 200 server racks. And there was one older server in there. Well, admittedly, it had a standard of 78 degrees. So they could still, of entering air, not total. But, still, it was like, oh, that one rack was determining the temperature for the entire room. And it's like, yeah, you're on the line. You're responsible. And I get that. And I know when to stop pushing, but we try to work with people. So, you mentioned that you had done some work in Iceland, and also I understand you did some work in Puerto Rico too, looking at data centers. Is that right? And
That's right. Yeah.
could you tell us a little bit about what you learned in your work in Puerto Rico?
Yeah, so in Puerto Rico, I spent time kind of during the pandemic doing some research on data center resiliency. And, amid the pandemic, which had, a huge spike in demand for digital services as we all kind of went online as a result of lockdowns. But also, there was this, I was also interested in the resiliency of these systems after hurricanes passed through Puerto Rico, and specifically Hurricane Maria, but also later, Fiona and other hurricanes that might rise, and just kind of this question of how can you design a system to be hurricane proof? And that was, in the course of doing that research, I discovered something that was really both troubling for me because and also just fascinating that during the fallout of Hurricane Maria, many of these data centers in Puerto Rico, which again are not really huge hyperscale data centers, many of them are small, but they were able to function without any kind of interruption to their services or power. Meanwhile, most of the island's residents did not have power for almost a year. So some of them 9 months reliable power they didn't have. They had power for maybe a period of time, and then it went, and then because of the grid's fragility. But these data centers were so insulated, so insular, so created to be redundant, as I said earlier, hyper redundant, that they withstood the hurricanes. But you also see that there's some injustice there, right? And that injustice was not lost on some of the people who worked in the data center. And so they took it of their own kind of, they made decisions to open up parts of the data center, which normally would not be open to the public. Because again, it's a very securitized place too. So that's another layer of redundancy is security. They opened up parts of it so that people could charge their phones, so that emergency responders who were trying to help people in the most chaotic weeks after the hurricane struck, to locate people, to provide supplies, we're able to use the infrastructure of some of these data centers to locate people, to call people, to coordinate. And so I thought that was a really interesting story of you have these rigid protocols and these rigid rules that can be broken in these states of emergency or these states of exception that hurricanes create.
Yeah, and as you mentioned with the redundancy, a lot of the backup generator capacity, for example, on data centers, or for that matter, any facility that has backup power systems, whether it's a hospital or something else, it's often in excess of what they actually need at all times. And so that's, could potentially be a resource. as well as a source of local noise and pollution, which it is on the flip side. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, I mean, and there certainly is, an opportunity that, it, and I won't be totally optimistic about this, but in the future, as more data centers are constructed throughout the world, and many tech companies have these goals to expand their market. So that means getting people connected who don't have access to the internet today or don't have reliable or regular access to the internet, and by building data centers closer to them so that they can have certain services that they can't have now. And there is a dilemma there, right? So to build a data center, it needs water and power. And if the people in that community don't even have water to drink or power for their homes, what are the ethics of constructing these gigantic facilities that are going to be used so much resources when the people around who would stand to benefit from them don't actually have any of those basic infrastructures provided for them? And so I see it as an opportunity, but again, there's always a danger too in valorizing too much, what can be done. But if a data center is built and power is built and water infrastructure is built, then that could be shared. That's an opportunity. But how does that actually play out is a whole other story in terms of like regulations and making sure that certain interests are protected and so forth, and that it isn't an exploitative relationship.
Yeah, which kind of brings us back to the whole issue of regulation, since these are dominantly developed as private operations.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned they're starting to be built all over the world. I guess the United States has the most, with something over 5,000 data centers. Where's the biggest data center in the world? Is it in the US?
Actually, the largest data center in the world is in Mongolia, I believe, or it's in northern China or Mongolia.
Yeah, Inner
And it is
Mongolia, they would call it. Yeah.
Yeah. It is the size of it's quite enormous. I'm not actually sure the exact figure, but it is close to the size of a city. And this is just an amazing feat of engineering to build something this massive. But it also is I guess it could be a glimpse into what the future might be for us, as artificial intelligence demand soars and the need for more of this computing infrastructure increases. More data centers will be built. Will they be small? Will they be kind of micro data centers or edge data centers that are kind of built close to us that have a smaller scale, or will they be these gargantuan city scale facilities like the one that we just talked about? And it's really a question that we don't have a total answer for yet. But what we do know is that the AI demands are not going away, and that we also know is that by Microsoft and Google's own reported statistics, and they've self-reported this, the water use of their facilities has increased from 2021 to 2022. For Microsoft, 34% more water use, and this coincides with the rollout of AI applications and workloads, and in Google's case, 20%. So it does not look good for the water issue.
Wow. And is all that water for cooling, or is some of it used for something else?
So water is used in data centers for a few different applications. The most resource intensive use of water is for actually cooling the equipment, and that water has to be filtered and recycled. It can be recycled for a few times, but then it has to be dumped eventually because of the accrual of particulates and corrosive particulates, but also the risk of contamination and pathogens and so forth. But then water is also used sometimes for hydroelectricity generation in some facilities, and that sometimes is counted as part of this figure. And then there's also water that's used to a very small degree, as you mentioned earlier, to actually humidify or dehumidify the data center atmosphere. So the actual air inside of the facility has to be within a certain humidity threshold, and it can't vary too much, because if it's not humid enough, then there's a risk of electrostatic shock and discharge and fires. And if it's too humid, then there can be real consequences, as water just completely destroys the equipment, as was the case in a metadata center in Prineville, Oregon, where it actually rained inside of the data center.
That can't be good for the machinery. Although it does seem that there have been, the computer equipment itself has become more resilient over time. That is, it's tolerating higher temperatures. They've got higher data densities, in terms of how much data you can handle per watt of input, for example. I don't know, people in the tech field tend to be very optimistic. Oh, well, that trend will continue forever. It'll keep getting better and better. But there is actually an absolute limit up against which we may be already coming. Is there any other way besides just simply not needing to use data that we could limit the amount of this, of data center construction and operation that we have?
Yeah, I think certainly there are ways. I think this also comes down to the fundamental purpose of cloud, which is actually, in my view, there are two reasons why we use this. One is it's a convenient way to store information, but it's also a way to offshore or outsource computational work. And what I mean by that is using somebody else's GPU, for instance, to perform some computationally intensive activity. In the case of, cryptocurrency production, for instance, is very computationally intensive. It's very energy intensive. And so doing that, or doing like an AI generation or rendering of some kind, those things they use more energy because they're actually like computational work. But just like storing information in a server and then accessing it is actually less energy intensive, because it's not really, it doesn't have the same kind of mathematical calculative functions behind it.
Right. Yeah. And putting something into a memory chip as opposed to having computations going on between semiconductors, definitely less energy, less activity going on.
Right. And so then since there's the storage side and then there's the like remote computation side, I see that there are actually many solutions to the storage side. I mean, there are emerging technologies that are exploring this, and I won't be too much of a techno optimist here, but there are people who are exploring the use of synthetic DNA as a kind of storage system. We've had other analog systems in the past, like tape and so forth, that work quite well, and they're actually way more durable than our disk drives. So the digital system that we have today, these disk drives don't last for very long, more than 10 years, and some of your old hard drives will be unreadable, or they'll start to have fatal errors, and you'll notice that some of the things in there are no longer accessible because of this phenomenon called bit rot, right? But in the future, there could be other ways to store information that don't have the same environmental footprint. So synthetic DNA, it doesn't emit heat. The storage system itself doesn't emit heat, right? It would be only in the act of retrieving it. Whereas right now, I put something in the cloud and it is emitting heat actively as it is stored. And so is there a way to do something, what we call cold storage? There are other technologies as well, like ceramics and glass, 5D etched, laser etched glass that can store information, and it can do it in a way that's actually way more durable. So tens of thousands of years of durability versus 10 years on your hard drive. And so there are possibilities technologically, but I think also, my main point of emphasis remains regulation and not letting the tech industry dictate the terms of its own regulation in the way that it has been for 2.5 decades.
Yeah. And maybe that's a key takeaway here, but we have a couple minutes left. And so I wanted to invite you, Stephen, to just tell us what you would like us to remember about data centers and the cloud at this point, from all the research that you have done.
I think the most important thing to remember is that the cloud is not in the sky. It's very much on the ground. There are humans. You might imagine a futuristic technoscape, a cyberpunk images of these data centers with neon and chrome and so forth, but they're not so glamorous. And there are people who actually live in that cloud and work in that cloud and make it function. And so, since it is run by people and it's not run by this magic of robots or technology on its own, then it can be changed. So things that are created by people can be changed. And so there is hope for a future where we have an information ecology that is less damaging to our planet, because ultimately it is composed of and run by human beings.
Wonderful, thank you. And is for people who want to follow up and maybe catch your book when it comes out, or follow any of the other work that you're doing, is there of course, an online source that they can go to find that information?
Yeah, this is the part where I confess to you my digital footprint. I am actually on X as at Cloud Anthro, and that's where you'll find most of my updates regarding my cloud storage research and data center research. But you can also find more information about my scholarly publications and speaking engagements and all kinds of things on my website, which is stephengonzalezm.com. And that is hosted on a somewhat sustainable cloud platform.
Relatively speaking. Well, Thank you again, Stephen Gonzalez Monserrate. It's been fascinating and great having the opportunity to have this conversation with you. So thank you again for being on the show.
My pleasure, Len. Thank you so much.